Welcome, welcome to our first plenary. I'm Mary McClintock-Fulkerson. I will be moderating this fascinating panel. What remains divisive? How exciting. Let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Bradford Hinze, Professor of Theology at Fordham University in New York. Bradford has done a lot of great work. He's working on grassroots organizing, theologically interpreting grassroots organizing. His current project is entitled Prophetic Obedience in a Dialogical Church. So let's welcome Brad Hinze.
Thank you, Mary. It's great to be with you this morning. This session is devoted to the question, what remains divisive? My co-presenters from Kenya and Greece are addressing issues associated with post-colonialism and gender, both important, pivotal issues of our day. I wish to begin my remarks by offering what may seem a rather perplexing, if not inflammatory, proposal. An ecclesiology of communion can be, and in some instances has in fact been, divisive. To put the matter theologically, the Roman Catholic ecclesiology and pastoral program of communion, with its emphasis on the Church's sacramental character and evangelizing mission, have combined with certain tendencies in the current Pope's theology of caritas and his defense of the Greco-Roman understanding of reason to eclipse and suppress the prophetic character of the Church and its mission in the world. This theological amalgam, communio, caritas, and reason based on natural law, has yielded a theological and epistemological frame that focuses attention on certain doctrinal convictions, certain personal and social formations, and certain practices, while leaving other doctrinal and practical elements out of the picture. By supporting a paradigm that obscures and marginalizes essential features of the faith, this theological composite has contributed to divisiveness and polarization in today's church. There are also comparable versions of an ecclesiology of communion in other churches. These have all played an important role in bilateral and multilateral ecumenical dialogues and statements. What remains divisive? An officially sanctioned vision of communion that eclipses the prophetic mission-oriented character of the faith. When charitable activities are rightly promoted as a crucial part of the Church's mission, while discrediting the Church's mission of promoting justice and grassroots democratization. What remains divisive is when the call for the use of reason, as understood in Greek and Latin traditions, to perceive an order in reality, risks imposing an order on reality at the expense of facing reality, honestly, and embracing reality, irrepressible reality, the refractoriness of reality, in ways that have ample room for the use of critical reason and creative reason in engaging reality. The challenge before us, if we are able to address these divisions, is to reclaim the prophetic character of the life of faith and to foster prophetic communities. Only then will we be poised to discover a new, more adequately multivalent approach to communion, charity, and reason, one that incorporates and honors genuine prophetic witness in word and action. Reclaiming this prophetic office, I wish to argue, demands that each Christian and each community respond to the call to cultivate three things: a certain prophetic attentiveness, prophetic discernment, and prophetic witness. To take up this challenge requires taking a deeper look at how we understand prophecy. The biblical charism of prophecy has usually been understood in terms of an inspired word, heeded, received, and responded to in witness and proclamation. But prophecy has likewise been elicited by the equally important work of the Spirit, given expression in the aspirations and laments of God's people, and in the groaning of God's created world. This work of the Spirit provides the wellspring of the prophetic mandate. It is my conviction that the primary framework for construing prophecy as word heeded, received, and responded to in witness must be complemented by this offsetting framework that brings into focus the equally important role of the Spirit's voice in aspirations and laments. This claim orients my further argument. The prophetic witness of individuals and communities finds the source of their inspiration and motivation in aspirations and laments that spring up from precarious life. By precarious life, I refer to the vulnerability of human existence, a vulnerability felt with special intensity by those who mourn or who are at risk of losing basic necessities of life: food, health, affection, employment, health care, housing, legal status, loved ones, or life itself. Dorothy Day wrote about the precariousness of the poor she encountered in soup kitchens, homeless shelters, picket lines, and on the streets of New York City. Emmanuel Levinas invites readers to ponder the demand to be responsible made upon individuals by our encounters with the face of the other and with the stranger, focusing especially on the precariousness of the defenseless one. More recently, Judith Butler has thought deeply about precariousness and as an existential concept related to the phenomenon of mourning, and precarity as a political notion for addressing life under the conditions of precariousness. She advocates a more inclusive and egalitarian way of recognizing precariousness that should take form as concrete social policy regarding such issues as shelter, work, food, medical care, and legal status. For Butler, although we are able to apprehend precariousness, we may or may not be able to fully recognize it, depending on the frameworks within which we work. If we fail to fully recognize precariousness, our social action suffers. My understanding of prophetic attentiveness to people's aspirations and lamentations corresponds with the basic features of Butler's views of the apprehension of precariousness. My emphasis on prophetic discernment as the impetus for prophetic witness bears similarities to Butler's perception of precarity as the basis of recognition and social action. The prophet is attentive to movements of consolation and desolation, but especially to the wailing of the Spirit in situations of vulnerability and mourning that rise up amid human and cosmic travail. The genre of lament, so central in the variety of literary forms of the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures, provides a deep wellspring that can nurture and guide critical reason and the productive imagination toward the exercise of prophetic discourse and action. We can discover each of these dimensions of prophetic identity being cultivated today in ecumenical and interfaith communities. And I wish to highlight those influenced by faith-based community organizations in the tradition of Saul Alinsky and his heirs in the United States, but also globally. The first step in the formation of such prophetic communities for these communities themselves is to cultivate attentiveness. These faith-based communities train people to listen to the aspirations and laments of all the members of the community, especially the marginalized among them. Alinsky urged organizers and community leaders to pay attention to the hopes and griefs of those in the local communities. Step 2 involves cultivating practices of communal discernment. When we think of prophetic discernment, we often think of biblical prophets identifying the links between idolatry or political and religious corruption and social problems that aggravate the plights of the poor and the marginalized. In every era, prophetic discernment entails analysis, social analysis of situations of injustice. This is how communities identify how destructive powers work in the human heart, but also in collectivities, institutions, systems, and cultures. In early Christianity, certain holy men and women carried on the legacy of the prophets by promoting discernment. One of these was Evagrius of Pontus, an Egyptian monk of the 4th century, who earned a reputation for his ability to discern destructive powers and the impact of evil thoughts on the lives of individuals and communities. He identified 8 such thoughts that became the basis for the subsequent tradition of the 7 deadly sins. For Evagrius, the sources of these deadly thoughts were demonic powers at work in the self. The last 50 years has witnessed growing insight into the impact of social sin or structural sin. I believe that Evagrius needs a 21st century counterpart. We might symbolically name her Evagria, who would consolidate the collective wisdom of the last 50 years by offering an analysis of deadly social sins. Her provisional list would certainly include political and economic forms of domination that become institutionalized in laws, policies, and practices that undermine freedom, democracy, and the just distribution of wealth. Also on this list would be institutional racism, collective bias based on gender and sexual orientation, and forms of religious extremism, paternalism, and radical secularism. Prophetic discernment ultimately entails reaching judgments about reality. The prophet is summoned to obey, to listen not only to the word of God, but also the voice of the Spirit heard in the aspirations and laments of the people of God and world. By encountering, learning from, and coming to judgments about these laments and aspirations, the prophet is impelled to respond. That response is an act of prophetic obedience. Prophetic obedience is neither blind obedience to authorities nor to the mob. In the final analysis, prophetic obedience must stand the test of genuine discernment. Prophetic obedience is the mature form of faith in action. The third step needed in the formation of prophetic communities is witness in word and in deed. Here again, we might learn from Evagrius. Late in his career, Evagrius received a letter from a leader of a local monastic community, Lucius, who pleaded with Evagrius to compose a treatise for wrestling with demons that were threatening the vitality of his community. Responding, Evagrius prepared a handbook entitled Talking Back, Antieretikos, in which he offered his analysis of the 8 vices or evil thoughts and constructed ways to combat the corresponding demonic powers by means of talking back to them, drawing inspiration from the words of Scripture. Talking back offers practical strategies for holding powers accountable and, when justified, challenging them. Contemporary faith-based community organizations and our symbolic figure Evagria insist that prophetic communities also need to witness by talking back and acting up in the public realm against the collective forces of injustice and cultural forces of affliction. This is what spiritual maturity entails. Faith-based community organizations promote diverse forms of witness, regularly challenging elected officials, business leaders, and other influential people in the community, sometimes even religious leaders, all in the interest of promoting social justice and the common good. Enacting genuine communion through caritas and the proper use of our God-given reason is not possible unless we can find ways to cultivate prophetic attentiveness, discernment, and witness, which includes talking back and acting up in our own churches and in ecumenical and interfaith communities as well. In closing, I wish to honor the memory of the prophetic witness of St. Francis of Assisi by making a special appeal for more widespread engagement with Muslims in the formation of prophetic interfaith communities committed to promoting social justice. As most of you probably know, during the 5th campaign of the Crusades, St. Francis reached out to promote peace by traveling to the Muslim Crusade Center in Damietta, Egypt, where he met Sultan Malik al-Kamil in 1219. There took place a genuine interfaith encounter and dialogue in the interest of promoting peace. I believe that in our own day, to act in the spirit of St. Francis and the Sultan, similar efforts must be made to establish interfaith community coalitions of Muslims and Christians for promoting social justice as the basis for genuine peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. We will, at the end, after a response to the papers, have time for questions. So now let me introduce Mary Gatui, professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa, previously at Kenyatta University. She has published on religious education, culture, gender, and she's been involved in ecumenical initiatives in Kenya and internationally. She also chairs the National AIDS Control Council in Kenya. So let's welcome Mary Gatui.
Good morning. And in Kiswahili, jambo. It's a great pleasure for me to share with you the topic, the Post-Colonial Divide, the questions we must face before entering into dialogue. The questions raised here below are based on 10 themes. They are basically informed from an African perspective, but the global context also features. We gather here from different contexts. Our history, our culture, our geography, our religion determine and influence our worldview. And given this, then one of the questions that we need to face is what is my context, what is your context, what is unique, what is similar, what is different, and even strange. So number one is the question of context. Number two is the question of the global village. Thanks, especially to technology, we are intertwined. But the question is it the same twine in use by all? Are some twines stronger than others? Is the global village concept deceptive, that we are all at the same level? Question number three is the concept post-colonial era. What determines it? Is it time? And does it mean the same for the colonizer and for the colonized? And as one of my professors could ask, who is it that is naming? Who is it that is naming the colonizer, and who is it that is naming the colonized? And do these terms mean the same? Number four is the issue of independence. I come from Kenya. 1964, we got our independence. What were the expectations and what were the promises? Have they been realized? Have they been fulfilled? If not, why not? If you were to talk to a middle-level Kenyan, they would tell you that as the independence thread was moving, and some of the expectations were not being met, then the yardstick changed. By the year 2000, we'll have clean water, we'll have free education, and we'll have free medical cover by the year 2000. As we speak now, in my country, we're talking about Vision 2030. So from the year 2000, we've moved to Vision 2030. And all of us are looking towards 2030. It means that my mother, who had very many expectations and promises at independence, will wait for 2030. Independence, what does it mean to us? Number five, one of the themes or issues that we must face is, again, colonialism. And under this, there are several issues that we need to ask. What was the motive for colonialism? Is this motive still prevailing, or is it manifested in different forms? Is there colonial baggage or hangover, as it were? What and who determines aid? As it was mentioned, I work with the National AIDS Control Council, and one of the issues that we are struggling with at the moment is that donor funding is dwindling, and we must face HIV and AIDS as a country. Many times, we haven't determined what comes in. And sometimes when we need it, it's not coming. So who and what determines aid? We are also asking, is there internal colonization? What about the brain drain? Our doctors in Africa. Very few, but they are getting greener pastures elsewhere because the past elsewhere is bigger. I'd like to echo the words of Oginga Odinga, not Raila Odinga. This is the father, one of the champions for independence. He wrote a book many, many years after independence, and the book was titled Not Yet Uhuru. In other words, not yet independence. Colonialism, colonization. You read that book, it says they are still on, but probably in different manifestations. Number 6, one of the questions or issues we must face is the pre-colonial era. Are there lessons that we can learn for today? And from Africa, religion was embedded in all aspects of life. Conflicts were present, but long-term and long-lasting reconciliation. Promotion and preservation of life were key and central. We might fall into the danger of mystifying and glorifying this past, but we need to ask ourselves, are there lessons that we can learn from the pre-colonial era? Are there elements that we can include in our syllabuses? Are there elements that we can include in our peace efforts? As I was coming here, I picked one of the magazines, and the argument there was the efforts in Rwanda, the Gashasha courts. These are the local traditional courts. There were two voices, one from Rwanda saying this has really helped, where the community has been involved in the efforts of reconciliation. And another voice was saying from elsewhere that there is nothing scientific about this. But when we look at Rwanda, it is one of the countries that is gaining stability because they have looked to their pre-colonial past and are borrowing from that. Theme number 7 is Christianity. As I said earlier, this paper focuses much on Africa. Christianity is a strong institution in much of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. But Christianity has been associated, linked with colonialism. It has been associated with and linked to denominationalism. It has been associated with and linked to ethnicity. In Kenya, if you were to ask, which is your denomination? And I told you I'm a Methodist, you could easily place me in Meru. If I told you I was a Seventh-day Adventist, you could easily place me in Kisii. If I told you that I was a Presbyterian, you could most likely place me as a Kikuyu. Christianity has been associated with and linked with disparity and marginalization. Again, if you came to Kenya, you could hear voices from the predominantly Muslim coast and northeastern regions. They say you only took schools to those places where you took your religion. Christianity has been therefore associated with and linked with division and distribution of the national cake. Christianity has also been associated with and linked to political paternalism. And so the question we are asking, or we should face, can Christianity and other religions play a more unifying role? And basically then, number 8 is the same questions we're asking about Christianity could be asked for other religions. So that takes care of issue number 8, that is Christianity and other, or versus other religions. Number 9, we come to Christianity and other institutions or other issues. And these are the emerging and the contemporary issues, as it were, that are calling for attention. My sister is going to be talking about gender issues. Not because I work with the National AIDS Control Council, but the issues of health, HIV and AIDS. We cannot talk about dialogue, we cannot talk about ecumenism outside these issues. In Kenya, on the issue of HIV and AIDS, one of the challenges we face are the voices of the faith-based institutions, because they are divided and sometimes they are very, very rigid. We cannot talk about dialogue and ecumenism without looking at environmental issues, technological advancements, terrorism, human rights, the family, and the school system. One of the concerns for us in Kenya is the school system and how Christianity or religion is dividing us. We have a Christian religious education curriculum where in secondary school, the students are given an option of either taking Christian religious education, Hindu religious education, or Islamic religious education. They are given an option, and more often than not, a child and the parents will recommend that you take that which is in line with our practice. And so we find that there is a lot of disparity. There's a lot of growth in the education sector. We have very many universities, but these universities are also springing up along denominational lines. And so we are asking, is the school or the education system promoting for ecumenism and promoting for dialogue? One of the interesting courses that I teach, a master's class, is family and sexuality in the Christian context. And the question that we have not been able to answer as yet, even as we have come to the end of the semester this time, is what does family mean for us in Africa today, particularly the urban family. A study was done at Kenyatta University, where I was working before, and it was said that the average time a father spends with their child is 37 seconds. In the busy urban context of Nairobi. And this time is based on questions such as, get ready to go to school. Have you done your homework? What is it that you are doing? And that's the kind of interaction that we have with our children. So what are the contemporary emerging issues? Because we cannot talk about dialogue, we cannot talk about ecumenism, if perhaps we don't have strong holds in the very small unit of family. As I come towards the end, number 10 is the issue, the question of dialogue. Who is really interested in dialogue? And who is the key player? What is the agenda when we want to talk about dialogue and when we want to talk about ecumenism? What and how is the process? Which is the most appropriate time to engage in dialogue? In one of our schools, the young people said, the teachers only wait for crisis, then they want to talk to us. At that point, we are not ready to engage in discussion. We just want the issue sorted out. So what is the most appropriate time to engage in dialogue? Are faith-based institutions the good or the legitimate players in this dialogue? What is distinct about their voice? Many years ago, in the early 90s, the National Council of Churches of Kenya used to issue statements. Whenever there was an issue, they issued a statement. Then a time came and they kept quiet, and there were several issues. And when everybody thought that they had gone silent, then they raised yet another statement. They said, in our silence, we hoped that you were contemplating. We hoped that you were thinking. And that which had been taken to be silence actually came up like a bang. And the voice of the National Council of Churches of Kenya came out distinct and clear. One of my students has just written a paper, and she's saying, in line with what my brother just said earlier, says, prophetic voice to voicelessness. What happened to the church? That may not just be in Kenya, but probably elsewhere. In conclusion, these questions and many related others have to be faced, not in a move to seek concrete or conclusive answers, because many of you are teachers in this room. We know that we have a marking scheme when we mark, but that's not the case here. But these are questions which help us to search our souls, to contemplate, to be practical, and that has been covered in the previous paper very well, not to talk about theories. Divisions are inevitable. Borders in our lives are inevitable. Sometimes even borders within our own selves. But what is important is the attitude and the spirit and the positive spirit employed in understanding the root cause, the consequences, and the implications for humanity now and in the future. I'd like to end with a symbolic attitude or ritual in Africa. A person is a person, regardless of race, religion, status. even when one killed in defense of the community, they were not regarded as a hero. They've killed in defense of the society, in defense of the community, but they have interfered with life. They have to be cleansed before they are embraced back to the community. Because that could have been an enemy, but you have killed, you have interfered with life. And this recognition of the value of the person perhaps is what should guide us as we ask these questions. And I believe that if Francis was to hear about this, that this is how, from the African context, we looked at even conflict, that the underlying factor is that there is a person involved in it. He would say, a person is a person. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Eleni Kasalouri. She's a Greek Orthodox theologian, is a lecturer at Hellenic Open University, the master's program in studies in Orthodox theology. Her research is on women in the New Testament, the Orthodox Church, and ecumenical dialogue. Let's welcome Eleni.
Since we are in Italy, buongiorno a tutti e tutte. Thank you very much for the invitation. For the very first moment that I received the invitation, I was sure that it will be a fascinating meeting. Before I begin my short analysis due to the limit of time, allow me two preliminary remarks. First, my presuppositions for reflecting on the topic are those of an Orthodox scholar. By the term Orthodox, I don't mean a strictly confessional point of view, but what, from my ecclesial, spiritual, and theological experience, I consider my understanding of the authority of the tradition to be. Second, the views which are expressed in this paper don't and cannot claim to be the Orthodox understanding. This is quite obvious for both historical and theological reasons. For historical reasons, because of the various secular contexts within which Orthodox communities are scattered around the world, and theological because in Eastern Christian tradition, generally acknowledged as more constituted by a Trinitarian understanding of the Church, we firmly believe in the diversity of the charismata of the Holy Spirit. Whenever an Orthodox theologian, especially a woman, has to speak about orthodoxy, she finds herself in a very strange situation. What is the specificity of orthodoxy at a time when the very attribute, orthodox, is widely understood as having more or less negative connotations? By many Western theologians, as Professor Vassiliadis notes, orthodoxy has to come to signify stagnation in church life, inflexibility and unwillingness to adapt to modern situation, at best, an Eastern phenomenon vis-à-vis the Western modality and perhaps the Western theological process. In discussing the ministry of women in the Church, especially in the ecumenical framework, such ideas are widespread. The influence of the secular feminist movement, the rise of multidisciplinary women's studies together with the stimulus of the writings of American feminist theologians, the Second Vatican and the work of the World Council of Churches were some of the catalysts for the development of the various feminist theologies all over the world, first in Western Europe and US, and then in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As a body of theological perspectives and ways of working on Christian tradition, Feminist theologies are as distinctive and diverse, culturally, ethnically, racially, socioeconomically, etc., as are the women writing them. They all challenge the churches by raising various questions about the definition of theology, the human and women experience, the imagery of God, the theological language, the hermeneutical methods and tools, the hierarchical structures of the church. Dealing with such questions leads contemporary feminist theologies to be one of the most dynamic and creative fields of scholarship within theology today. On the other hand, the discussion on women in the Orthodox churches is a relative recent field of research. While some gender, I would say few, theological research has been undertaken by women scholars in US, France, and Greece, for example, the main focus is biblical exegesis, and regrettably, most of this work is not available in English. In general, in Orthodox territories has been for decades a resistance to the women's questions and the feminist movement, which are both perceived as the province of secular feminists that is destructive of tradition and family. The early church developed her ecclesiology and in turn her missionary practice on a radical eschatological teaching of the historical Jesus about the kingdom of God, which, as modern biblical research has shown, moves dialectically between the already and not yet. In other words, it has become already in the present, but it will be completed in its final authentic form in the eschaton. From the writings of Paul, John, and Luke, in addition to other works, we see this teaching reflected in images of the church, of the body of Christ, as vine, and especially as unity. Paul, in particular, was absolutely convinced that all through baptism, completing with the Eucharist their incorporation into the one people of God. The fourth gospel develops this radical eschatological teaching even further in regard to the unity of people of God around Christ and their incorporation into Christ's body, above all, through the Eucharist. The main contribution primitive Christian theology made to the development of this messianic eschatology was the common belief of almost all theologians of the early church, emphasized and underlined most sharply by St. Luke, that with Christ's resurrection and especially with Pentecost, the eschaton had already entered history, and the messianic eschatological community becomes a reality each time the church, the new Israel, the dispersed people of God, gathers επί το αυτό. This development is undoubtedly the starting point of Christian mission, the springboard of the church witnessing Exodus to the world, which in the fact interpreted the imminent expectation of the parousia in a dynamic and radical way. The whole Christian tradition, from Jesus preaching for the coming of the kingdom of God, through the Ignatian concept of the church as a Eucharistic community, with the bishop as the image of Christ, down to the later Orthodox tradition which understands the Eucharist as the mystery of the church, and not one mystery among others, reveals that it is the eschatological and not the hierarchical nature of the church that is stressed. In Orthodox theology and liturgical praxis, the church does not draw her identity from what she is or from what it was given to her as institution, but from what she will be, that is, from the eschata. According to Orthodox theology, the church is understood as portraying the kingdom of God on earth, that is, as being a glimpse or foretaste of the kingdom to come. A natural consequence of this understanding of the church is the equal, active, and creative, or should be, and creative presence of all members, women and men, and the enrichment of the life of the community with their special talents and characteristics. The Eucharist is always the center, the way, and the vivifying force of renewal, where all persons and all creation are gathered together, lift up and united in the once and for all offering of Christ himself. The Eucharist offers not only the bread of life necessary for our spiritual growth, but lifts up our hearts and minds, enabling us to see with a new vision the life that God has prepared for us from all eternity. It is in the Eucharist that we come to know one another as members of one body, united in love of Christ in the image of the Holy Trinity. It is in and through this communion in the Spirit that we are given the strength and the power to fulfill Christ's mission in the world. According to the report of the Inter-Orthodox consultation, Your Will Be Done, Orthodoxy in Mission, which took place in Neapolis, Greece in April 1988, the mission of everyone is to know Christ, to live in Him, and to witness to Him by word and deed. When our Eucharistic assembly experience this truth, the necessity to share the joy of the resurrection with all people is a natural consequence. The Church mission also calls us to the task of peacemaking, reconciling, and defending justice for everyone, especially in contexts where the people of God suffer from injustice, violence, oppression, and war. When the Eucharist assembly does not engage in such outreach, it fails to realize its missionary responsibility. I close the quote. In other words, each time Church loses the real Eucharistic eschatological essence, content, and orientation of now and then, it becomes a hierarchical body fossilized into external power and acquires the characteristics of a secular society that is dominated by the idea and logic of power and authority. That is why, despite the richness of the liturgical and spiritual life, which is strongly influenced by the baptismal confession of Galatians 3:28, in you there is neither Jew in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you all one in Christ Jesus, and never ultimately betrayed by the Church, at least on a theoretical level, there still exist opinions, customs, and prohibitions that have created discrimination against women. These darken the true image of the Church and are traumatic for the unity of her members. Elizabeth Bercizel rightly pointed out that, I quote, the position of Orthodox women provides a particular striking illustration of the contrast highlighted by Lev Sile. The deep contradictions include the liberating message of the gospel, which exists alongside outmoded taboos. They include both the spiritual and the personal theological doctrine of humanity, which exist alongside stereotypes of gender inherited from patriarchal societies. The universally present icon of Mary, Mother of Jesus, radiates a tender and deep femininity, but the altar is bared to women. The women who brought the spices to the tomb on the first Easter morning were the first to announce that Jesus was risen and are honored in the Orthodox churches as apostles to the apostles. But the reading of the gospel in the public worship is still limited to male ministers. Close of quote. Increasing numbers of Orthodox scholars nowadays maintain that some of the elements of the tradition, central and essential, especially those influenced by the historical and cultural reality, though they are, should be reinterpreted and reevaluated. It has been the international discussion on gender, ecumenical discussion on gender issues, that many pressed Orthodox theologians, clergy, and laity to articulate the theological, anthropological, and sociological reasons for the exclusion of women from the sacramental ministry, debate the understanding of the Trinity in Orthodox tradition that precluded any change on the liturgical language, and re-examine the roles allotted to women in the Church, embellished with the words of holy service and glorious motherhood. Some sacramental practices of the Orthodox Church, for instance, the presentation of infants and the 40-day rule for childbirth, the exclusion of women from the altar, the prohibition of women from participating in leadership of the entire act of worship, so that they may not preach, have been also openly discussed. In this direction, The women's program of WCC offered a great support. A series of meetings between 2000 and 2010 have gathered the voices of women of different Christian traditions and cultural backgrounds. Women theologians, women working in the church and in mission, had the opportunity to listen, to learn, and to discern together the signs of the times. According to my opinion, these mutual enrichments has been useful and creative in many ways. Although a way of life and thought cultivated systematically for centuries cannot be changed easily, it looks to be no longer an obstacle for all who are fighting to establish a new reality and a full way of participation in the church with the purpose of making her the authentic community of all sons and daughters of God. Callistus Ware, in the new edition of Women and Priesthood, confesses that, I quote, "In 1978, I considered the ordination of women priests to be an impossibility. Now, I'm much more hesitant. What I would plead is that we Orthodox should regard the matter as essentially an open question. Let us not imagine that in this area everything is clarified and finally settled. For manifestly, it is not either for us Orthodox or for other Christians." According to me, Orthodox women theologians today can contribute to the theological discourse in order, as Alexander's Memnon pointed, to make theology an essential belief and a creative function in the lives of all, to make the Ecclesia a genuine deposit as well as an expression of love, sacrifice, and an unselfish, thankful society. And in doing so, they can begin with one of the key mottos of feminist exegesis coined by Judy Chicago: "Our heritage is our power." The female face of Orthodox tradition is not well known and is still to be explored. We are in the process of realizing that despite the positive and optimistic ecclesiological vision of our church, what we can describe as a democracy of heavens, this vision has been somewhat distorted in the practice. Valerie Karas farewell reminds to Orthodox that, I quote, "We need to ponder the questions: are we more eschatologically oriented in other areas of Christian life than we are in areas that have to do with the liturgical roles of men and women in the church?" And she continues, "Insofar as that answer is yes, we are guilty of what may be termed sexual exceptionalism. Given this tendency, we as Orthodox need to challenge ourselves why we are unwilling to apply to women's liturgical life in the church the same eschatological orientation that inform us in other areas of our Christian life." I will close in agreement with Leonie Liveris, a modern Orthodox theologian, who in her book Ancient Taboos and Gender Prejudice, Challenges for Orthodox Women and the Church, suggests that in order Orthodox women to challenge the teaching of the Church that recognize the charismas of women, but not their intellectual and spiritual equality with men, there is a demand for using feminist hermeneutics of suspicion, of canon law and scriptural interpretation, and critical analysis of the practices of hierarchy and patriarchy. In other words, it is imperative for Orthodox women to break the silence on gender discrimination, challenge patriarchal prejudice, and question the culture and tradition of exclusion that denies them full participation in the life of the community. Grazie tanto.
Thank you so much, Eleni. And now for our respondent to these fascinating papers, David Montealegre. He is a Colombian Methodist theologian. He has his MA in Classical Studies from Buenos Aires University. He studied ecumenism and interreligious dialogue at Geneva University and the Ecumenical Institute of Basel in Switzerland. He's participated in the Latin American Consultation on Religion, EATWAT, and he's now a doctoral student at ISEDET at the University in Buenos Aires. Let's welcome David.
Well, here we are. Yeah, after 14 hours of travel, and thank you for this invitation. Being a Latin American, and I have gone through different processes of reorganization that has imposed us to adapt ourselves to the state of globalization, has made me understand that it is vital to emphasize the three elements present to us this morning. Reality of post-colonialism, to which we must address before addressing the issue about what still divides us, reflection of gender as a key when we talk about ecumenical unity and justice, and finally, the idea about the Ecclesiological of communion as tool that help us build a way for unity. In my view, each work presented deals with fundamental issues when trying to answer the question that brings us together. I observe each paper concern we have about unity of the church and its visibility in the world. However, there is a point that I want to highlight and use as the basis of my possible answer. Thinking about what remains divides us is not just talking about differences that must be overcome or issues that must be taken into account in the construction of Christian unity. Speaking today of what still divides us is talking about what unites us and separates from the world and from today's culture. It is perhaps more serious than discussion on Eucharistic, sacraments, or baptism. It puts us, in some cases, in an uncomfortable position in front of our identity as Christians. Today, our world is plural. Our culture is now more than ever a wave of diversity. However, many people still continue to think that diversity is problematic and should be seen as an issue to be resolved. I want to approach my answer describing the virtuality of the ecumenical movement structure as a system of unity that accentuates the differences. I think it's time in Yves Conga's word of a re-reception of our faith. The problem, the logic of the virtuality in the structure of the church, unity in the traditional ecumenical movement. Reading Wisserhoff's statement about the abnormal situation of the church, naming the fundamental problem of the church is the existence of the churches, we begin by examining what we will call the performatic logic of the system, that is to say, the epistemological and theological claims that stretch across the idea of unity proposed by the traditional ecumenical movement. For this first statement begs the question, is the diversity of the church a problem? Do we have, in fact, a church split or a vision of unity that does not really allow its own levels of diversity? Can we separate the church from the churches? And if we do, what do we have? What if that which remains in the eternal truth of Jesus Christ? Why should its diverse manifestation be a problem for unity? Moreover, doesn't this statement show a fundamental problem? The weight of the Christian church is such that any structure that wants to join its elements must be strong enough to withstand not only a fierce outward movement, social, political, economical aspect, but a second inward movement, aspect of the doctrine. The two movements together actually represent one bigger movement that we can refer to as non-duality. That is to say, that all may be one. I understand the idea of one as not opposed to multiple, and even less an illusion to uniformity. Given these considerations, we will now look at how this logic permeates the entire structure and how said structure has been built. In WCC Assembly statement and World Council of Church Assembly statements throughout its history, we discover some elements that have been reinforced, repeated, and rewritten. Those elements provide the data to speak about the structure of the concept of unity proposed. Common confession of the apostolic faith. A common sacramental life, which is accessed by the one Baptist celebrating one Eucharistic fellowship. A common mission and witness of the gospel of God's grace and of the service to all creation. These three elements acquire vital cohesion thanks to two theological keys. However, something more is needed to complete the picture. If we read carefully all ecumenical declarations, each of these develop an idea of bigger inclusion, each of them advance in the quest for unity, offering each time a spectrum of understanding wider. At the beginning, the unity is expressed almost as a creed. We will call this stress paradigm spiritual confessional. A second emphasis is the need to include the prayer and common witness to the concept of Catholicity, everyone, everywhere. We will call this stress paradigm of Catholic Eucharistic. A third emphasis and clear reference to a more pluralistic vision of unity, we have the ascent of the social aspect own of the ecumenists themselves. In this way, a relationship of tension is produced, which we will call the paradigm of dynamic tension. A final emphasis has happened in the last decade. We will name this emphasis as paradigm of diversity unity. We use the Borromean node to draw the structure of the unity. Well, in this type of structure, it is not possible to speak of one or two-dimensional. Nevertheless, this diagram is for other paper. However, why do we call it virtual? As Levi Pure says, we should understand virtually not as opposed to reality, but as opposed to the actual. I quote, "In the scholastic philosophy, the virtual is that which exists in power but not in the act. Virtual tends to be updated, although it isn't concentric in an effective or formal manner. The tree is virtually present in the seed. With all philosophical rigors, the virtual is not opposed to reality, but to actual. Virtually and actually are only two ways to be different. Above these arguments, it is necessary to retain the fundamental distinction between possible and virtual, which explains Gilles Deleuze. The possible is already formed, but, I quote, remains in the limbo. For Deleuze, the possible will be made without change in its determination or nature. The possible is identical to the real, and it only lacks existence. Thus, the virtual is not opposed to reality, but to the actual, due to, unlike to possible, static, and already constituted, the virtual becomes the problematic assembly to knock of tendencies of force that companions a situation, even object, or any entity that claims resolution process. The update, the problem of seeds, for example, is to grow a tree. The seed is the problem, but it's just that, which does not mean it knows the exact shape of the tree that eventually spread their foliage about it. Taking into account this limit imposed by its nature, the seeds will have to invent it, co-produce it in the circumstances of the moment. Now, regarding unity, the traditional ecumenical movement problem is to understand church unity by means of an apparently flexible structure rather than legalist one. However, it currently seems more rule-oriented, fixed and current. Then the problem is not only how to understand and make unity visible, but the structure that ultimately leads to the understanding of the unity doesn't know the exactly way to produce unity. Nevertheless, it pretends to know it actively, ignoring or not recognizing the limits imposed on its nature. With respect of this matter, if we are talking about unity, it's not because there is a problem with diversity, but because it's precisely diversity that questions the idea of one as topos and pressure the integration of the plural identity of the church as a constituent part of the one. In other words, unity presented as current is actually virtual and, as such, cannot be considered as given processes and impossible to update. The method used by the traditional ecumenical movement is updating. It means the ecumenical movement has created a way, a solution to that knot that resists to its virtualization and its node as actual. This process causes a problem in the identity of the denominations that grow themselves from the idea of virtual unity rather than the model of actual unity. Accent on differences. As we have observed since the beginning from this reflection into various declarations about church unity, consensus what it is called Catholicity, despite this consensus obey a theological logic, already present in Wiesenhoff Declaration about the abnormal situation of the Church. And as Bert Hodemark and Theo Wilvet well say, the ecumenical movement was possible in modern Europe thanks to these divisions, a result of many social, political, and military conflicts. These divisions made theologians begin to wonder how to facilitate the construction of an identity and how set in motion a process of unity in the midst of fragmentation. Unfortunately, the decision was to recognize the communalities and view with great suspicion any kind of plurality that could create a conflict for reunification. So, the emphasis on plurality or diversity as richness becoming a problem or unnecessary risk. Thus, in modern Europe, plurality assumed a negative connotation. This idea, equally performative, is presented in the structure for unity proposed by the classical ecumenical movement, assuming that diversity should be limited in favor of accentuating common points, such as declaration makes the richness of our churches appears a threat to unity. Once again, we see how the model that pretends to be virtual is actual and is presented as domineering and challenging to diversity. It is not about losing the common elements and now only see the differences. It is rather about to see how, in the knock of unit formed by the apostolic faith, sacramental life, and mission, each sector of the Christianity contribute to comprehension of our identity as Christianity. To quote Raymond Panikkar, is a theology of the inseparable but distinct from the one, but is a theological knot where each element, charisma, cannot be replaced by any other, but none others can be without the others to remain. This has effect on churches and denominations. Each church denomination is particular. Each of them participates, includes, and wishes to participate in the ecumenical movement from its ethos. Its subjectivities are multiplied and have developed throughout history in many contexts. Never before, like nowadays, perception of what they are is each time more pluralistic. We are aware that they have elements that nucleate them, and to the affirmation of their identity are added common theological bases. Faced to this becoming, the traditional ecumenical movement proposes a model from shared points in common, which actually force the dynamic identity for denomination churches to the assumption of unity from margin of their subjectivities. This action result in that the marked differences are remarked. The effect of long-term action is twofold. It means churches initially engage in dialogue from the age, which the traditional ecumenical movement structure brings, naming common, but in future, common reveals the multiple and how complex it is to talk about unity. So they discover that common is actually a multiplicity of view of one, and not only the basis of agreement and convergences in the council's meetings, even if it helped to the understanding of unity. See from our model, problems start when the unity is understood as a result of an actual process, a process that starts from the conception of unity as something to achieve and toward which all denominations' identities go. This movement from outside to inside can be understood as centrifugal. Here, the force of differences and plurality is absorbed by the core concept of unity. We can argue that we don't distinguish between unity as God's gift and unity that must be lived and witnessed. Nevertheless, we again have a problem because understanding unity in two parts is to fragment the theology that support it. Because speaking of unity is to talk about dynamics and intrinsic relationship between action and gift of God. Thus unity is exactly both, action of the church and mystery of the one, in middle of dimension of the plural. In other words, there is no unity as God's gift without being expressed in the action of the churches, and this process before being centrifugated is centripetal. Then unity can be understood and being a reflection pluricentric and performative action of the churches on the gift action of unity proposed by Jesus. Given the above, it is clear that that raising the question of unity from the basis of communalities is incomplete and limited. We need to recognize the richness of diversity and otherness as an essential part of the one. Finally, diverse and united is recognizing that diversity is working no longer in what we do make certain churches include and recognize others as part of the body of Christ, or that we can participate in a mass celebrated by others. While this task can continue, perspective and emphasis must be changed by an ecumenism that is able to recognize that plurality is foundational axis of our Christian roots. It is not uniformity or opinions, but harmony of hearts awake. The goal is a greater understanding of what it means, oikumene, from the plane of the Word of God in Jesus Christ. That has been read and reread for centuries from various levels. In Panikar's words, a corrective criticism and better fertilization between the words, religion, tradition, without diluting their heritage, and to prejudge its eventual irreconcilable differences. Instead of an assembly for inclusion or doctrinal statements about the sacraments or similar situation, we need a meeting for rethinking our diversity, and from that work about a re-reception of our faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Now we have about 25 minutes for questions. What I'm not sure about is if there's a microphone for questioners. Sir, if you'd stand and speak loudly, please.
Should I rewind?
No. I'm not sure we have time for you to.
Okay, so what do you say about this ecumenism of Caritas, which I think is actually one of the positive things I find in Benedict's writings?
Oh, is it on? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Stan from Nigeria, who's living in Canada. I think there's a great deal that can be affirmed in Benedict's statement about Caritas. in the Augustinian tradition, in the Bonaventuran tradition, that I think it's important for us to embrace. However, I don't think we can affirm it at the expense of other currents, biblical currents, historical currents, in the tradition of Christianity, throughout the history of Christianity, that are deeply biblical. And my paper is basically a plea for us to say, how can we acknowledge and affirm that Benedict's theology, we don't have to personalize it. How can we affirm that the official theology of communion may have many good things to say, but that it's occluding, it's blocking out certain things that are very important for us to affirm, embrace, receive in our tradition, and that we do not affirm them at our own expense. That it's a detriment to our faith. So in the end, yes, I've made a point that's saying this is a problem because it's occluding, it's eclipsing this prophetic tradition. And I think we need to go back and pull that out and reaffirm that and find a way of reaffirming that in a way that can accept and affirm the importance of the tradition of caritas as we find it in Augustine and Bonaventure as well.
Back there?
Follows on fairly neatly in a way. Brad, thanks to all the speakers. Thank you very much. Paul Merrick from Durham University in the UK. Thanks, Jared. I like very much, Brad, what you're doing substantively with the call for the prophetic, the mission-oriented character of the church. And it's basically just a comment and a question. The comment is, and I recognize it's been boiled down to a very short presentation out of a much larger piece of work. The comment is, towards the end, you emphasize the importance of each individual taking responsibility for the prophetic dimension, which I entirely agree with. I presume you complement that and extend it into the importance of ecclesial practices, collective practices that are prophetic and that challenge the collective, the overwhelming collective practices that require those. That the question is to do with the rhetorical strategy that you adopt, okay? Because at least in this very short presentation, the appearance of the rhetorical strategy is that you are opposing what can be unhelpful in certain articulations of communion ecclesiology, with the need to rediscover, reclaim important aspects that are lost from view, too easily lost from view, with the prophetic dimension. And the implication is that you are seeing in communion ecclesiology the fact it too easily is about uniformity, is about a certain subordination to hierarchy perhaps, and perhaps remains too easily in the sanctuary, the liturgy, the devotional. And your prophetic is wanting to reclaim the importance of diversity, the importance of each being an active participant, and the importance of our participation, our liturgy, being life and not just sanctuary. I just wonder whether rhetorically that's a helpful opposition that just buys into and perpetuates some of the culture wars that we have in Catholicism, and whether rhetorically it might not be possible to really reclaim something of what communion ecclesiology can be, could be, should be, by drawing out the prophetic heart of the communion of the Trinity. So it becomes an integral critique and expansion rather than, but maybe it is just the form of the very short paper that has set that up.
In my paper, I indicate that it's both a personal and ecclesial dimension. And in fact, I've emphasized the ecclesial dimension of it in the paper, the importance of developing prophetic communities in the local church, parishes and dioceses. I understand the point you're making, that 15 minutes I have to be more rhetorically pungent. At the same time, I must say that at this point in history, Paul, I think my role as a theologian is to try to honestly assess where we're at now and to try to take stock of what has transpired over the last 30 years or last 50 years. And that requires a certain honesty about what I see transpiring. And that must incorporate an element of acknowledging and stating at face value what I see as going on. I take no pleasure in that. I'm not a polemicist. If any of you know me, you know I'm not a polemicist. That's why for me to be employing this kind of rhetorical, developing my argument in this way, I'm simply trying to state matters as clearly as I can. In the end, I think, Paul, you're right. I want to someday, as our Orthodox representative said, there is an eschatological fullness I want to reach someday, where we can, I thought a lot about Tillich, Catholic substance and Protestant principle. And that what we're trying to do now is to think at much deeper levels about that, biblical, historical, drawing on an array of theological traditions, much like our last respondent said, drawing from the richness, receiving the richness of our diverse theological traditions. We'll need all that to bring these various streams together. So anyway, but I'm not going to apologize now, or I don't see that it doesn't do any good to say we do it within a communio paradigm, or we don't do it at all. I think that's restrictive right now, and I want to open things up more.
Ma'am? Right here.
Sorry, for the contribution and the diverse perspectives that you presented. I have a question to each of the three of you, starting with the Meregitui. Looking at the questions that you raised and the conclusion that this emphasis of a person being a person, and how that actually determines the kind of responses that we have to wrestle with regarding the questions. Do you have, I know it's only 15 minutes, but I missed your input from the contribution that women are bringing to such questions. And going to Eleni, the great works that we've done together in really listening and trying to bring up the issues about Orthodox experience of being church, especially as women. I would really want to hear from you how you think we could continue this dialogue in a way that we invite the male, I don't know, like the theologians, that the church leaders, to come to a table where such issues are not just issues about women and women raising them, but they are issues about the nature and the being of the Orthodox Church. And to Rinze, David is very lucky. I'm not tampering with him. Rinze, you started by, you talked about three things that a prophet has to, to engage with. The first one was attentiveness, active listening, and analyzing the context and what you are hearing. I have problems with the question of being prophetic as just an agent of change and of renewal to community, and not really as starting with your own vulnerability as a prophet. Let me say that I think for me, attentiveness should start with you listening to your own vulnerability, your own struggles, and starting from there to engage with the struggles that you hear around you. Because otherwise you become a savior to the community rather than being part and parcel of that renewal that starts with you. Can you say something about that?
Thank you very much. Perhaps not to blame the time, but on the theme where I was talking about Christianity and other institutions and other issues, that is basically where I cover the issue of women, the issue of gender, and given the panel that we had, I think my sister was going to cover quite a lot of that. But I'm not insensitive to that issue, as well as many other emerging issues. Again, I'll borrow from the work of one of my students who is asking, what care are we giving to the deaf? What care are we giving to the people with various challenges in our churches? And then in Kenya, now we have a very strong voice of youth saying we are really not very well taken care of. So in brief, in the emerging and contemporary and other issues, I have a bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fulata. It was indeed a pleasure for Orthodox women, I think, also to cooperate in the frame of WCC, because it offered with various meetings the opportunity, first of all, to become familiar with the Western, I'm sorry I'm using feminist, I know that it is a lot of criticism around the world about the term, but I should use a terminology at least, okay? So feminist readings of the Bible tradition. What I wanted to stress in my paper was, first of all, that we have two levels of discussion. One level is the internal discussion that the Orthodox do, and that means laity and clergy, Orthodox theologians, I insist on theologians, should honestly discuss the role of women in the church. And the second level, of course, is in the ecumenical framework. We have to acknowledge that within Orthodox Church, we have various trends, more liberal, I don't like the word, but okay, more liberal and more conservative. 2 years ago, a great book published from Aristotelis Papanikolaou, who is Brand's colleague, and Elizabeth Prodromou, and it is a good book because it opens all these difficult issues that Orthodox, they should answer. First of all, the role of women. Second, the role of the laity in the life of the church. Thirdly, the matter of the language, which I also referred it in my paper, etc., etc. So we are start to discuss, but we need time, I think. We cannot move from one side to the other in a minute, but we need time. On the ecumenical framework, the conservative trends of Orthodox Church believe that it is because the ecumenical meetings and due to the ecumenical meetings and the discussion, the Orthodox tradition and the Church was influenced, and they read it as a negative issue. The liberal trends believe that this is a very positive one, and this is something that can move things forward for Orthodox theology and Orthodox Church. We will see. I'm very optimistic.
thank you very much for your question to me, because that is at the heart of the matter as far as I'm concerned. The category of precarious life is precisely about us being in solidarity with those who experience precariousness, but also for anyone to reclaim or to claim their own precarious life, their own vulnerability in life, and that one can't really be attentive to those outside without also being attentive to the vulnerable character that they themselves have. Some of that's developed in the paper, but that's precisely at the heart of the matter. And of course, it's always related to the larger issue you're raising about there's always a need to discern true prophets and false prophets. You know, genuine prophetic communities and those who are leading people astray. So those are always issues on the table.
I'm not supposed to, but I'm also going to add, and what I'm excited about this raising of the issue of women and gender, but also reminding us that gender refers to masculinity as well. Women aren't the only ones that have gender, and that's important. But we have to focus on this. So thank you all. Thank you all, and thanks the panel.
Before you disappear, we've got some important notices to give out about room changes and domestic arrangements for the rest of the day. So what would be helpful in the next minute or two is if you had your program available, then we can make any necessary room changes which affect the next session. So I'll do it by page number. So if you go to page number 7, which is today, in the next session, the middle session, Interfaith Issues, where it says Sapientia, it should be Perfetta Letizia. So wisdom becomes perfect lettuce, or whatever that means. And that room is down by the lifts. Okay, there's a list of these on the notice board, so if you don't get them down, don't worry. Page 9, which is the parallel sessions, then Food for Ecumenical Thought, Perceiving the Church, which is the first one on the left. The Sapienza there becomes Simplicita. Okay, that's the room on the ground floor. The room, page 9, the Perceiving the Church, the first session on the top left, Sapienza becomes Simplicita. And the one on the right, Dialogue Beyond the Ecumenical Movement, the Cappella Santa Chiara becomes Sala Capitolo, which is next door. Then Race and Ethnicity, the last one on the right there, becomes, the Sala TV becomes the Frate Sole on the third floor. Page 11. The parallel plenaries, Sapienza becomes Perfetta Letizia, again in the middle session, the left-hand session there at 11:15. Then page 12, session 3, Sapienza becomes Simplicita. And page 13, session 11, the Cappella San Francesco becomes the Sala Capitolo next door. Then page 14, session 13, the Sala TV becomes the Frate Sole on the third floor. Nearly there. Page 15, session 14, first session, Cappella San Francesco becomes Sala Capitolo next door. Session 16, the Sala TV becomes Frate Sole. And on page 16, this is the last one, session 20, Sapienza becomes Simplicita. And I won't take any questions on that, but we will put the list up. And Gerard's got some other notices now for the rest of the housekeeping.
Just to extend a note of thanks to all our excellent speakers and our chair this morning. Herman Pottmeyer had a great metaphor of Vatican II, and therefore as a church post-Vatican II, as an unfinished building site, and something this morning put me in mind of that. But there are some very important things that you need to notice about some practical things. One is there are a few people, a handful, who unfortunately could not make it. So we'll try to let chairs know, but if somebody doesn't turn up to your session, it means one of three things. One, that they're not here. Two, that they're lost. Or three, that they stayed too late in the bar. So if somebody isn't there and you're beginning, then, and we haven't managed to inform you, then presume that they're not coming. Lunch for Thursday in Upper Assisi, because there are so many of us, and Assisi is a small city, we've actually made arrangements with some restaurants to expect large groups. You'll have to pay, but we've made 160 reservations in 3 different restaurants. I think it's free. And the menus, and it's going to be a fixed menu, so it's ready and it's quick and it gives you more time, are actually posted outside. But you'll need to sign up. So obviously it's not going to serve us any purpose whatsoever if everyone goes to the same restaurant. So it doesn't mean if you're not one of the 160, you won't get any food. There are lots of restaurants in Upper Assisi, but it just means it will be quicker. You can make plans with friends and go to the same place. And there's a variety of different options with those restaurants. Also, there are lots of, not fast food, because that is a heresy in Italy, but there are also some restaurants up there where you can get a slice of pizza and take something quick and allow yourself more time as well. But please sign up today for those restaurants for Thursday. Volunteers, there's going to be a meeting in the staff room down towards the bar right away after this. Coffee is also going to be served for everyone outside. The bus process. Now, this is 2 very important things. Please be prompt for the buses this afternoon at 4 p.m. and tomorrow morning. And please bring your name badge. Your name badge is the ticket for the bus driver. And if you don't have your name badge, he won't let you on. So please, please, please make sure you have your name badge in order to get on the bus. Please be prompt. There are going to be 2 buses. Each one takes 80 people. It's not luxury coaches. That means standing as well. And 2 buses will leave promptly at 4 p.m. So please try and be early, some of you, and some of you can get the next round. Those buses will go up there. It will take about 20 minutes, and then they'll come back to pick up the remainder. Now, the buses can only go so far. Assisi is a medieval city, so the buses will stop you at the car park named after John Paul II. And then, so, I'm not going to go there. Or the Porta San Pietro. So it's a short walk, and there are actually escalators as well. It's a little bit of a climb, and if anyone will have a problem with that climb, please let us know, and we'll try and make sure you can be shepherded or even get there via some other means. But do allow plenty of time and be prompt, and don't forget your name badge. Tomorrow morning, slight change for the buses. 2 buses will depart at 7:30 a.m. So please, some of you, especially those of you who are early risers, please take your breakfast early and be prompt outside, ready to take the buses at 7:30 a.m. And I suspect it will be 7:55 by the time they get back to take the next group. So please try and be on the ball tomorrow morning. I know this morning we were all arriving in dribs and drabs at various times, but tomorrow is very important so we get started on time and we don't fall behind for the whole program. Tonight, after we finish in San Francesco, dinner is free in Upper Assisi. It's not free, you have to pay for it, but I mean, there's no plans. And again, just get into small groups, head towards Upper Assisi and use any of the great restaurants up there. I think that's it. Yep, okay, so coffee outside, and then we reconvene for the parallel pre-new sessions afterwards. Thank you again.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't think of the, getting the microphone.
Oh, no, I forgot as well. I forgot. We were supposed to do it. Actually, I wondered if they'd leave it in there, but actually they should have thought of it before us. And they also should have thought of maybe telling the guy with the pneumatic drill. Did you hear that badly up here?
No, I couldn't hear anything at all.
When Brad started, it was on both sides. Both sides, yeah. There was somebody in the ceiling. There was somebody, no, really? I'm so sorry about that.